The West London Murders. Detective Rob Miller Mysteries, Book 2, by Biba Pearce. Narrated by Nathaniel Priestley. Chapter 1. Adam Youssef was in a good mood. After months of hard work, everything had fallen into place. His business was thriving. He'd finally found someone to marry his fat, socially awkward daughter and take her off his hands, and he'd just bought a banging new BMW. To top it all, he'd had a great afternoon and was feeling totally relaxed. The doorbell rang. Adam smiled to himself and stood up. Time to get to work. He checked his reflection in the living room mirror and was pleased with what he saw. He still had all his hair, his teeth were straight and white, and he had a strong, aquiline nose that spoke of good breeding, even though nothing could be further from the truth. He'd grown up in a dingy two-bedroom flat with threadbare carpets and not enough heating in winter. His father was a cleric, his mother, well, she was nothing. She couldn't even cook that well. Maybe that's why his father had been so rough with her. She drifted in and out of the shadows of his memory, a fragile figure in a dark headscarf, eyes downcast, too timid to utter a word. It was his grandmother, his father's mother, who'd had the biggest input into his upbringing. He had spent many happy weekends at their double-story house in Finsbury Park with his cousins, eating as much as they could and riding their bicycles up and down the street. It was Tita who had decided which school he'd go to and what subjects he'd study. She'd always treated him with respect, even more so than his father, who, she never missed an opportunity to point out, had made such an unfortunate marriage. The doorbell chimed again. "Coming!" he yelled and walked down the passage to open it. His smiling guest's breath turned to steam in the cold afternoon air. Adam was looking forward to spring. He had a big back garden, perfect for barbecues. He shook their hand. "Hello, good to meet you. Please, come in." He stood back to let his guest into the house. His cleaner, a sexy Polish bitch, had been that morning, so it looked better than it did most days. Having grown up with his mother picking up after him, Adam hadn't learned the value of cleaning up after himself. He didn't see the point. Wasn't that what wives were for? And if you were blessedly single, like he was, then you hired a cleaner to do it for you. He led his guest into the lounge, a spacious room with a leather lounge suite, a glass coffee table, and an enormous flat-screen TV suspended on the wall. The television was also new and, after the Beamer, his second favourite possession. He'd bought it with last month's windfall. He knew the boss had said not to splurge on boys' toys, it would draw too much attention, but he didn't think a little reward here and there would do much harm. It wasn't like he was on anyone's radar. Hounslow was full of middle-class Muslims like him. "Would you like a drink before we get down to business?" It was gone 4 o'clock, an acceptable time for a drink. He may have grown up in a strict Muslim household, but he wasn't a believer. The only thing he believed in was money, and lots of it, so that he could enjoy himself. Wasn't that what life was all about? Hence his choice of occupation. But for his friends and family who had no idea what he did for a living, they thought he worked for a property development company. He played the part of the devout Muslim. He even went to Friday prayers. He had to be seen to be doing the right thing. He was an upstanding member of the community after all. He chuckled to himself. He'd always enjoyed subterfuge. Most people were idiots. They believed what they saw, what they wanted to believe. What had religion ever done for his father? He was a hard-working cleric who'd spent his life serving Allah, and for what? A squalid council flat in northwest London. No thanks. This was England, after all. Capitalism thrived here. For a man who knew what he wanted, it was easy to make money, and the police were either too soft or too stupid to figure it out. "I'll have a scotch," said his guest. He poured them each 2 fingers and sat down on the couch. His guest downed it in one go, and that's when he noticed the gloves and that he hadn't offered to take their coat. How remiss of him. He offered now, but his guest refused, instead rising and handing him the empty glass. I think it's time we got down to business. I don't have all day. Of course. I'm interested to hear your proposal. He was about to get to his feet when he felt a hand on his shoulder, followed by a sharp pain in his chest. He staggered back onto the couch, confused. That had never happened before. Was he having a heart attack? He looked up. His guest was holding a knife. What the? He glanced down and saw a red stain appear in the center of his 450-pound Giorgio Armani shirt. It was mesmerizing. The blood dark red against the pale blue material, growing bigger as he watched. Another thrust and the blade pierced his chest, where he imagined his heart might be. He howled in agony, but then felt a snap inside him. It was hard to breathe. He clutched his chest and stared up at his guest. Why are you doing this? He tried to ask, but it came out as a frothy gargle. Panic set in. He was a big guy. Maybe he could overpower his attacker. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled and he collapsed. He'd lost control over his body. The whiskey glass fell to the floor, the amber liquid staining his cream carpet. He was annoyed about that. He just had the place recarpeted. His guest straddled him and lifted the knife again. The frenzied expression sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Adam's body. No! He held up his hands in an attempt to protect himself. It was too late. His guest plunged the knife into his abdomen, pulled it out and thrust it into his chest again. He gasped as the strike took his breath away. Stop, he wanted to say, to plead, but his attacker was beyond reason, caught up in their mad bloodlust. As Adam's vision began to close in, the blows kept coming, each more frenzied than the last, until the pain finally faded away and he lapsed into blissful oblivion. Chapter 2. DI Rob Miller was sitting down to breakfast when his mobile phone rang. He glanced at his perfectly cooked poached egg, crispy bacon and toast, then at his phone. Leave it. Yvette perched prettily opposite him, her satin nightgown falling off one shoulder, her hair over the other, a cigarette between her fingers. You know I can't. He reached for the phone. D.R. Miller. Yvette blew a pillar of smoke into the air and leaned back, watching him with a deceptively calm gaze. He knew that look. Beneath the serene exterior, she was simmering with annoyance. I've got a case for you, Rob. It's a homicide in Hounslow. Uniform are already there, but it's yours if you want it. It was his boss and head of the Putney Major Investigation Team, Detective Superintendent Lawrence. Hounslow, in West London, fell under their remit, and even though Rob's team weren't officially on call that week, they were picking up the overflow. Sure, I'm in. Rob didn't need to think about it. Great. How soon can you get there? It was rush hour on a Tuesday morning. He glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 30 minutes, if he gunned it. I'll text you the address. Yvette stubbed out her cigarette in the heavy glass ashtray and stood up. I take it you'll be gone for the rest of the day? Yeah, probably. He stuffed the egg and bacon between 2 slices of toast. Breakfast to go. His wife of 7 months pursed her lips in a perfect pout. Of course. Rob put his makeshift sandwich down. Yvette, we talked about this. I have to go back to work. They won't give me any more time off. He'd been half-assing it for months now because Yvette didn't like being left alone for too long. Despite the extenuating circumstances of his situation, they'd been more than lenient. It's time. She lit another cigarette from a box on the countertop. He noticed that her hand was shaking. I know, but I don't have to like it. Rob squeezed her shoulders. Relax. You're safe here, and you've got Trigger for company. The golden Labrador at her feet thumped his tail in agreement. She nodded bravely and his heart went out to her. He knew she was still terrified of being by herself. Ever since she'd been abducted last year, she transformed from haughty and confident